Dear students, after learning this module, you shall be able to understand. Number 1, know the nature and meaning of culture. Number 2, identify the various aspects of culture and understand the various theoretical orientations that currently amalgamates culture within psychology discipline. Introduction to culture, meaning and its definition. There had been a long-standing debate over the term culture. Theories from different disciplines proposed different facets of culture. Various definitions of culture reveal different levels of facets of culture. According to Taylor, 1871, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a man or woman as a member of the society. Hansokovic defined culture as man-made part of the environment that is constituted, perpetuated, and modified by the belief and action of an individual. Hereby, in both definitions, culture is projected to be a real entity reflected through the artifacts and the life scripts acquired through the process of inculturation. However, the latter definition of Hansokovic emphasizes that the fact that the constituted manifestations of culture can be transformed by human beings during the course of development of the society at large. Hofstede in 2001 defined culture as collective programming of mind. In this context, members of the nations have programmed their minds in such a way that they acquire a particular mode of thinking. In society like in Western countries, individualistic mode of thinking is programmed in the minds of the individual from Eastern culture countries. Cole in 1996 shared that culture is continuously recreated through the outcomes of innumerable day-to-day transactions which happens. These two definitions emphasized that the culture subjectivity exists in the ideas and reflected through the actions of the individual who are the part of that society. However, the first definition argues that the culture is evolved by the influence of the climatic and historical factors in existence, hence show resistance in change. The latter definition emphasizes that the culture is modified and recreated continuously through the action of individuals living within the society. Yin, Park and Park in 2000 said, culture can be defined as the rubric of pattern variables. The researcher had taken analogy of colors to understand the variable. As various paintings, colors combine to form a pattern, constitute together as a whole to form a rubric. Similarly, variables of the given culture have to operate as a whole to form a culture. The paintings achieved after the integration of the various colors is a superordinate construct that can be compared to culture. Thus, culture is a superordinate construct that provide meaning, direction, and coherence to its members who follow it. The researchers add, since colors that people use help in achieving desired outcomes, similarly, culture can also be defined as collective utilization of natural and human resources to achieve desired outcomes. Lastly, how one conceives the term culture and operationally define this term in a research will have long-term implications on the kind of investigations like cross-culture research or cultural research or indigenous research, methodology like experimental or ethnographic, or integration of the two or more methodologies together. The locus of areas, that is multiple nature or single nation, and perspective of the researcher, that is insider or outsider perspective, that can be a part of the research.
Popular culture versus academic culture. In the book Understanding Cross-Cultural Psychology, 2007, Pito D. Laungani examined culture and expressed the word culture have multiple meanings and therefore it is difficult to define this word. According to layman, culture is a term which refers to the way the person behaves. In this context, we attach such adjectives to the cultured individual as being polite, mannered, educated, considerate, caring, etc. While academicians and professionals from natural science background gave completely a different notion of the term culture. To them, cultures are what are collected from human and animals and collected from human and animals and examined and analyzed in laboratory. Academic disciplines such anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, economics, political science, journalism, and so forth, on the other hand, have formulated their own conception of cultures. At the popular level, the word culture is used, many would say abused, in such a way to make it virtually incomprehensible. One hears of culture of violence, the culture of greed, minority cultures, etc. Anthropological perspective versus psychological perspective. Looking at the history of anthropology and psychology, the subject matters of the two disciplines were immersed in cultural biases and formulated value judgment about the other cultural group. Anthropologists understand the influence of Franz Boas 1911 could realize these biases and attempted to make subject matter of anthropology free from value judgments, took a neutral standpoint by undertaking ethnographic studies. Researchers in this methodology followed a participant observation. However, it was more intense in nature, since they used to live within that particular culture for a long time. They experienced their lifestyles, habits, and rituals helped them to reach value free judgments about the particular culture. Triandus, 1980, observed that anthropologists construe culture in holistic terms. Therefore, he defined culture as the total activities, attainments, and activities of any specific period and group of humans. Anthropologists adopted relativistic stand, argued that each culture is unique. Schweder and Sullivan, 1993, and hence no comparison could be made between two cultures. Laungani, 2007, observed such approach had closed the door for anthropologists to explain intergroup cultural variations in universal biological and genetic terms. In contrast, psychologists had taken absolutism stance in psychology, ignoring importance of influence of culture for many years. They believed the psychological processes can be used as package universally for all cultures. Few definitions on culture given manifest the ignorance and insensitivities for culture within the group of psychologists. Baron Lunt and Araki, 1985, define culture as an abstraction based on common characteristic displayed in the behavior of a given community of people. This definition construes culture in manifestation of behavior. Otherwise, there is no existence of culture as such. As psychology developed, many psychologists emphasized several factors which constitute culture: ecology, physical geography, climate, common language, belief, etc. Leach, 1964, Murdoch, 1964. Few definitions that highlight such factors are: Welsener, 2000, construe culture as organized psychological functions which may be intrapersonal and also interpersonal. Haviland, 1975, said that culture may be seen in terms of shared assumptions where people can predict each other's actions in a given circumstance and react accordingly. Williams, 1979, expressed that anthropologists and psychologists used different modes of thinking vis-a-vis culture. Although both the disciplines contributed in broadening the psychological knowledge, psychologists put more attention on the process to be tested, while anthropologists used psychological processes to supplement what they knew to culture. However, despite differences in theoretical considerations, both groups, psychology and anthropology, showed fair degree of consensus in defining the nature of culture recently. Many psychologists acknowledged the effect of a value system of each culture on various psychological processes like perception, emotion, child rearing practices, socialization, emotion, etc. Thus, even psychologists' attempts to investigate and explore psychological processes which are cultural specific and cultural universal. In this endeavor, new interrelated disciplines such as psychological anthropology, cognitive anthropology, indigenous psychology, multicultural psychologists have emerged. The emergence of various interdisciplinary fields in psychology and anthropology has led to occasional cross-fertilization of research strategies. According to Longani, 2007, there are two kinds of features, primary and secondary features, that characterizes the term culture. According to him, there are five core primary features that describes all cultures. A. Every culture has a distinct past history that may be recorded in some form. B. It is regulated by political, legal, and social systems and communication networks. C. They may be guided by some religious beliefs and activities, rituals, and ceremonies. D. Artifacts unique to that society, such as literature, work of arts, architecture, painting, etc., values and traditions, which direct patterns of socialization, family pattern, and the whole social system in the society. The secondary features of culture includes a. Freedom from linguistic, religious, political, and social persecution. B. Shared common language. C. Internationally recognized common physical and geographical boundaries within which people of that particular society live. D. Housing and other living arrangement. E. Socially accepted dietary, health, and medical practices. Is culture a real entity? Roland, 1984, expressed that there had been a lot of debate amongst the theorists on the ontological realities of the culture. One group of theorists proposed that culture has a concrete reality of its own. It exists sui generis. Within the group of cultural realists, there are two kinds of conceptions proposed by this theorist on their existence. One group, cultural realism, believes that culture has their existence outside the individual. It exists in superorganic domain and has its own laws uninfluenced by people. White, 1947. A second group of theorists, that is, cultural idealists, believed that culture exists in the collective minds of the individuals in the society. However, there is a group of theorists, cultural normalists, hold that culture has no ontological reality. It is a logical construct abstracted from human behavior and as it exists in the mind of the individual. Is culture acquired? Roland, 2001, expressed that most anthropologists unanimously believed that culture is acquired. Rather, even animals acquire life scripts from the experience of other animals in their environment. Indeed, human beings have unique capacity to use symbols and signs. These signs are connected meaningfully to the objects existing in their environment. Thus, in the process of development, the individual acquires these systems of symbols ideationally related to the objects in the environment. Culture is acquired by observing the way the people live and the life scripts given in the community, experienced by each of us in the process of development. It may be acquired consciously or unconsciously. Is culture shared? Wallace, 1961-70, pointed that though all theorists believe that culture is shared, but they debate over the form and meaning of sharedness in the existing culture. One group of theorists believes that culture is shared through its behavior. It is exhibited in behavior in technological, political, religious, familial domain of the population. However, other group of theorists argued that culture is inferred through the symbol system. Thus, the culture in this context exists in the collective minds of the member of community. The ideas and symbols and meanings inferred from these signs and symbols are shared in the community through the process of enculturation and acculturation. Does culture determines our behavior? There had been a long debate over the fact that whether culture really exists or not. Few theorists argues that cultures have their independent existence outside the human being. Since culture has its ontological reality, White 1948 asserted that human behavior is merely the response of the organism to cultural stimuli. Human behavior is determined, therefore, by culture. Greets 1971 continues by asserting cultures have been characterized as sets of control mechanisms, plans, recipes, rules, instructions, what computer engineers call programs for the governing of behavior. However, those who belong to the group of cultural normalists relegate the existence of culture as any superorganic construct, and therefore asserts that culture cannot determine the behavior. Rather, it is the high level theoretical construct derived by investigators through inference, attribution, interpretation, or empirical generalization. Roland, 1948. Is culture necessary for our survival? Since the human being had been developed in a context whereby it is affected by the climatic, economical, political, and geographical conditions, the rituals, customs, laws, inventions, habits, that is, drinking, eating, etc., instills survival value for each human being. Culture plays an important role by sharing, transmitting these value system, ritual, laws, or to say life scripts to the individuals of the particular society. For example, what, how, where, and when to eat, drink, wear, etc. is transmitted within the individual through the process of enculturation and acculturation. Since the inception of psychology, culture of the individual is controlled in the laboratory conditions and presumed to be kept constant and controlled by researchers. The researchers have been ignoring the influence of culture of their own, vested in trust of making psychology as a discipline that is universal for all the people in different cultures. This mode of thinking prompted ethnocentrism, that is, differential evaluation of different groups. However, recent trends in development of disciplines in psychology sensitized the researcher of this big limitation of keeping cultural variable constant and their effort to bring a universal psychology. After sensitization of this limitation, psychologists had brought new researchers, whereby psychology is studied in terms of independent and dependent variables. Culture is a qualifying variable which represents the mainstream of cross cultural psychology. In cross cultural psychology was viewed as quasi independent variables category individualistic versus collectivistic, or individual characteristics. Yin et dot 2000. However, recent trends in development of disciplines in psychology sensitized the researcher of this big limitation of keeping cultural variable constant and their effort to bring a universal psychology. After sensitization of this limitation, psychologists had brought new researchers, whereby psychology is studied in terms of independent and dependent variables. Culture is a qualifying variable which represents the mainstream of cross cultural psychology. In cross cultural psychology was viewed as quasi independent variables, category individualistic versus collectivistic, or individual characteristics. Yin et dot 2000. Recent development in the fields of cultural psychology and indigenous psychology relegates the culture as an independent entity, rather, a framework for perceiving what is meaningful, relevant, and salient. Boas, 1991, Kagatis Bisi, 1996, Nissam Minang, 1992. Recent development in psychology indicates there had been a gradual increase in researchers which undertake culture as the core variable of the research. Cross cultural psychology. In simple terms, cross cultural psychology is an enterprise in which researcher compared two or more cultures on one psychological construct, emotion, cognition, etc. The goal of cross cultural psychology is to search for the common entity of psychological construct that can be observed in all cultures, that is, cultural universalis. In this context, culture is taken as an independent variable. Cross cultural research is an empirical study that attempts to examine cultural diversity as independent variable that causes changes in dependent variable, that is, psychological constructs. Thus, cross cultural psychology promotes three basic aims. A. Inspects cause and effect relationship where culture is no more a constant variable but a variable that can cause changes at a various level of an individual behavior. B. Promotes human diversity with uniformity, universalism. And C. Look into those psychological constructs collectively observed in the larger population of the universe. Methodologically, cross cultural psychology follows three steps for this endeavor. A. Testing whether the nature of psychological construct present in one culture is present in other or not. B. In process of testing, it also discovers new psychological construct observed in other cultures. For example, an emotion of lajja, that is, observed in particular state of India and nowhere else. C. Integrating the two kinds of knowledge about the psychological construct and arriving at a cultural invariant behavior within the cultures. Cross cultural psychologist perceives culture from an outsider's perspective. Culture in this context is seen as an attribute that affect the way people think, feel, and behave. Berry, Portenga, and Dasein, 1992. Siegel, et al. 2000. Cultural psychology. In contrast to cross cultural psychology, cultural psychologists espouse that culture is constitutive part of the individual, enmeshed within the lives of individual in their day-to-day transactions. It is difficult to frame culture as one of the independent variables. Richard Schweder, one of the major proponents of the field, writes, cultural psychology is the study of the way cultural traditions and social practices regulate, express, and transform the human psyche, resulting less in psychic unity for humankind than in ethnic divergences in mind, self, and emotion. Cultural psychologist perceives culture from an insider's perspective. From an insider's perspective, culture is something that is basic and natural. We are born in a culture, develop in it, and attach meaningful experience to everything objects, customs, rituals, etc. we encounter in our world. Thus, culture forms an important part of our identity during the process of socialization. We think through culture, and it is difficult to detach the attribute in individuality as a physical construct. Comparison between cross cultural psychology and cultural psychology. Cross cultural psychology. Definition of culture. Culture is viewed as something being outside of and apart from individual. Cultural psychology. Definition of culture. Culture is within an individual. It is way of knowing and constructing the meaning. The shared knowledge and shared meaning generate set of everyday practices. Two kinds of psychological process central to the field: A. Construction of meaning. B. Development and socialization. Cross cultural psychology. Methodology 1. To carry a procedure of one culture to another culture and to make cross cultural comparisons. 2. Derive problem and research questions for established psychology methodology. Cultural psychology methodology 1. To explore lifestyle and derive procedure and communication styles of culture unknown to you. 2. Derive problem and research question from the culture being studied. 3. Developing ethno theories. Cross cultural psychology. Culture as a variable. Culture is operationalized as an independent variable and it is being studied as index. Culture and human being. Culture is separate from human being. It is having its own ontological reality. Cultural psychology. Culture as a variable. Culture is operationalized as independent variable and it is being studied as a process. Culture as human being. Culture and behavior and culture and mind are indistinguishable. Cross cultural psychology. Few proponents of the field. Many researchers studying cross cultural psychology belong to the field of social psychology. Berry, Purtinga, Dasein, Segal, Lohner, etc. Cultural psychology. Few proponents of the field. Most of them represent the field of human developmental psychology, Schweder, Greenfield, etc. Indigenous psychology. The movement for indigenous psychology began in non Western countries, whereby the attempt was to develop a psychology for one's own nation. The repercussions of such an attempt for every culture will have their own psychological concept that is relativistic in nature. Enriques, 1993, identified two types of indigenizations: indigenization from within and indigenization from without. Indigenization from without can be observed when existing theories, concepts, and methods are transported and modified according to existing local bodies. In this context, knowledge obtained in the secondary source of information, in other form of indigenization, the models, theories, and concepts are obtained from primary source of information and thus developed internally. Indigenous psychology follows the transactional paradigm, where context itself, knowledge of the context, and experience in the context are the central aspects of research. Saying context itself means the realities that are existing about the context, and knowledge of the context states the perception about the context in terms of its meaning, salience, and important that the researcher gain in course of his transactions during day-to-day lives. The whole phenomena of experience forms the important aspects of the research. In short, the objective and subjective realities of the cultures are interrelated.
Culture in an Indian context. India, a diverse country sharing multi languages, religions, rituals, customs, lifestyles, etc. However, one thing that unites this country is collectivistic thinking. They give more importance to virtue than to the truth in moral development. Indian place lot of importance on three basic elements, that is desh, place, kal, time, and patra, person, for the critical appraisal of their actions. Their understandings and evaluation of the conducts are enmeshed in socio-cultural settings. Durganath Sinha in 1996 observed that Indian diversity in geography, economy, ethics, demographies, features, lifestyles, religion, languages, cultures, social settings, and so on and so forth, is an asset for the continent as it provides congenial environment for conducting enormous cross-cultural researches. Examining the past, one of the first systematic observations taking in influence of cultures in psychological process, perception, the time estimation, weight discrimination, color vision, geometrical optical illusions were conducted on Asian subjects, including India. In a study examining influence of culture on memory, Bartlett compared Indians and British students on the process of remembering. Thales compared Indian and Scottish painters and found that Indian subjects emphasize on the real attributes of an object in their paintings, while Scottish subjects, that is, whatever one perceives about the object. Likewise, innumerable comparative studies have been conducted on the process of moral development, child rearing practices, socialization processes, perception, cognition, gender behavior, and value systems. Indeed, the dark part of the whole story has been that Asian countries, including India, were treated as targets to obtain comparative data. Earlier cultures were kept at a peripheral, and the lack of verification in any findings from Western countries' perspective were explained by questioning the overall development of the children from the target Asian countries. However, cross culture studies have been sensitive to the culture, and no culture is the main focus, a major explanation around which each such findings are explained to understand the culture perspective. Thanks.
Let us summarize what we have learned. According to Taylor, 1871, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Hofstede, 2001, defined culture as a collective programming of mind. According to Laungani, 2007, there are two kinds of features, primary and secondary features that characterizes the term culture. Recent development in the fields of cultural psychology and indigenous psychology relegates the culture as an independent entity, rather a framework of perceiving what is meaningful, relevant, and salient. In simple terms, cross cultural psychology is an enterprise in which researchers compared two or more cultures on one psychological construct. Indian place has a lot of importance on three basic elements: Desh, place; Kala, time; and Patra, person, for the critical appraisal of their actions. Sinha, 1996. Their understanding and evaluation of conducts are enmeshed in socio cultural settings.